You might have noticed over the last few months that there have been quite a few videos on the channel related to Tudor and their releases. The ceramic variant that they released with the new Meta certified movement, talking about another new release in bronze with the T-fit clasp, all of those components. There was also a surprising announcement a couple of months ago about Tudor and their partnership, their official partnership with the Marine Nationale. This is a big deal. This is very important, not only chronologically, historically, but there's a great opportunity for Tudor to create a knockout of a dive watch. For me at least, the level of excitement and anticipation surrounding this release is big. It's huge, in fact, which is pretty funny to consider. I mean, I'm not much of one who loves the identity of Tudor, but when it comes to this particular partnership, there are few that come close. If we are to think broadly about the most popular, I should say the most iconic partnerships happening in the watch area, it's between Omega and NASA. That relationship has lasted for decades and decades, still continues. There's some great storytelling behind all of that, but next to it, it's the relationship between Tudor and the French Navy. If you are new to the channel, you might not know that I have a very particular fascination with military and the watches associated to various branches, because these machines are made for one specific purpose: to be the most practical, functional instruments, built to be used in the field, built to follow very direct specifications that don't deviate. In order to be highly functioning instruments, they have to be legible, they have to be accurate. There are so many parameters that they have to fulfill. And this is where the design and the manufacturing and that process gets your imagination going. The vintage arena is where we can study a lot about how these watches developed, not only for the civilian marketplace, but how they procedurally changed and evolved over time. A lot of these older technologies became the mainstay. Most recently on the channel, I made a video all about the watches of the French Armed Forces. And wouldn't you believe, there's a big section in the video all about the procedural development of the Tudor Snowflake and the Tudor dive watch that was affiliated to the French Navy for 40 years. Let's ignore the partnership for a moment and just think about the Tudor Submariner. I've thought about it, and the realization has come to me that this may very well be one of the most successful military dive watches ever made, ever issued, because of its international acclaim. Of course, we assign these watches to the French military today, the Snowflake name, all of that iconic status, but at the same time that this was going on, these watches were being issued to the American Navy, the Canadian Navy, South America like Argentina, even as far as South Africa. These models, all with fairly generic ETA movements, Rolex cases and bezels and all of those features, traveled across the world and were reliable instruments for years. So just that alone, that level of heritage assigned to the Tudor military watch is something they can really work with on their modern platform. And Tudor, as a brand today, greatly appreciates their history, their heritage. They in fact have a page associated to the military dive watches of that time. You should be seeing it on the screen now. Description all about the Tudor Submariner, about the different references, the 4 generations that were around between the early 50s all the way to the 80s, even the early 90s. With that out of the way, the established idea that many of us are excited, we are greatly anticipating what this release could mean. The fascination that we have with military watches, their designs, specifications, designations, as well as it being such a successful watch in its past, Tudor's modern identity, playing off this heritage, fits right in line with how they could design a watch that is not only paying tribute to those past icons, but at the same time introducing something new that can invite many more people back into the history that these watches have. Being military pieces, they have to focus on all of the specifications, being accurate instruments, precision made, built to modern specifications, and ultimately ushering in a new era. Like most of the videos I make on these releases, I see that great opportunity. That's where the true excitement comes from. At the end of the day, though, we have to be realistic. It would be nice to imagine that they will release X, Y, Z, but in fact, we have to look at it from a monetary point of view. We have to look at it from a production side. How can they release a watch that pays tribute to an icon without overdoing it, having to tool up new machines, having to completely integrate a new formula? This new edition won't be a complete overhaul, I believe. There are a couple of models in their line that we will talk about, mainly 3 of them, and the timeline they can base the inspiration on, linked to this whole Tudor Marine Nationale partnership, can be between the 1960s and the 1980s. These were the notable points in their history that they can draw the inspiration from. So question number 1, the return of the Tudor Submariner. Will they bring out a watch that looks eerily the same as the original 7016s and models that came after it? I don't believe so. We won't be seeing a model with the same case design, case format as the Rolex counterpart. This watch is going to be staying true to how the brand has established itself now. The next question is then the return of the Snowflake. For a brand that pays so much attention to their heritage and history and want to bank on that, this is the one time for them to bring out a Snowflake Submariner. Or at least I believe a Snowflake Black Bay. There are two variants within the Black Bay line that we can look at, as well as addressing the Pelagos as well. On the screen you might be seeing a few renders that are coming up that I will get to and talk about in more detail eventually. So let's say hypothetically that the return of the Snowflake is on the table, that this is where the watch might be going. Why is this a good idea? It falls in line with Tudor's identity even still, even today. It's one of the most recognizable dials in the watch industry. It seamlessly integrates with the handset that they have chosen, linked to their new lineage and their new way they position themselves. Most of us are probably nodding our heads now saying it's a no-brainer. This is the way it should go. And there are pros and cons to this configuration, which I will also talk about. Let's break down the three categories: the Tudor P01, the Pelagos, and the Black Bay. The P01 first, the outlier. This watch was actually made for the Navy back in the day. It's a watch that's based on a prototype that was made for the American Navy. It never launched, never got off the ground. It was still a concept, but the idea stuck. In a very rough render you should be seeing on the screen now, I decided to incorporate the blue aesthetics with a small Marine Nationale emblem on the bracelet. This could be done. It might look very nice, but then we have to also factor in that these watches are going to be in service. And as much as this watch does look great, quite the outlier in the category, the negative attached to it is that the bezel and the whole ratcheting system is a little bit all over the place. It's not exactly a feature that falls into the ISO certifications of a dive watch today, so it probably wouldn't qualify when it comes to being military tested. The next watch that deserves way more love in this category is the Pelagos. It's been around for a long time. It's the first watch they brought out in titanium, had an experimental helium escape valve, an adjustable clasp. So many modern adjustments that made this watch technically superior and efficient next to the typical Black Bay models that we've seen for quite a while. More than anything, it was the one watch that had the Snowflake dial already implemented. In this minor adjustment you're seeing, all I've done is bring the watch's size down a little bit, get rid of all the lines of text, leave two lines, remove the date complication, keep the titanium case, maybe even the helium escape valve, and that's it. The watch is plain and simple. It still looks like a Snowflake. Also incorporate a Marine Nationale logo somewhere. My thought was putting it offset on the side of the dial. Similar to quite a special Rolex Sea Dweller, the Samazotore model, where there is an emblem on the left-hand side of the dial too. This might be a nice way of implementing a logo like that on this kind of watch. But the reality is that the Black Bay, though it's a watch we have seen so many times, it now has become the standard. It is now the flagship. So next to the other two models you've seen, this one is probably the most realistic watch that will be implemented with the Marine Nationale flair. Just the other year we saw this watch released in blue. Could we say that this was done with some kind of anticipation that this partnership would be happening? Was this their way of testing that first idea? Who knows? Everything is pointing that way at least. Like I mentioned earlier, the inspirations that they can draw from between the 50s to the 80s, there was a great spectrum of watches that were made for the Marine Nationale at the time, all of which had their own specifics and dial formats. The first model, we can start at the very beginning. This is quite the outlier, but the late 50s, early 60s, we saw a few prototypical submariners that had what we call explorer dials. So Arabic numerals set between batons. We have seen that this configuration is most popular with the bronze Black Bays. The question is whether they could implement this in steel. Change the dots on the dial to dashes, and you have a completely different watch. One that looks functional, practical, well balanced. The relationship between the batons and the hands work extremely well. The only rounded elements on the dial are the numerals. That allows for your eye to break up the parts very easily. The 60s era Tudor Submariners adopted the typical dots and dash format that we now see commonly assigned to the Black Bay 58. Unfortunately, we could be in a position where we see this implemented. A blue dial, blue bezel, the Marine Nationale logo at the back, and the exercise complete. It would be a huge missed opportunity. This is something that we could expect, but I do still believe that Tudor has something up their sleeve for this launch. And then we move into the 1970s. The Snowflake dial is enigmatic. It's charming. It's geometric. There are so many things around it that make it fascinating. In the renders and the images that you're seeing, I've tried to appropriately size the plots on the dial to make it look as realistic as possible. Every single plot is slightly larger in size, even the triangle at the 12. It increases the presence, makes it more legible, turns it into an instrument. And the whole purpose behind this configuration was to make it a more legible dive watch for the Navy divers. So this is not only a stylistic change, it's also a realistic opportunity to increases the watch's presence on the wrist and also makes it a more practical instrument. In the presentation, you will also see that there are 2 lines of text on the dial instead of 3. This could be a time where they implement their new meta-certified movement that they've just released. We look at a front and back image, very basic, easy to understand, the typical Marine Nationale hallmark that you see on most of the original vintage divers. This one with 21 attached to it for obvious reasons, and a small Marine Nationale emblem at the base, maybe. We then move to the topic of patina, faux patina. The vintage models in this area had a very specific way of aging over time, and maybe Tudor would like to evoke some of those past ideas and implement some form of lightly colored dial loom. Not only that, but what might complete the image is to in fact fade the blue bezel. This doesn't impact the watch's overall legibility and does make it stand out quite a bit. In fact, this configuration might be something very appealing. If a model like this was released, there will be many out there who won't enjoy the way this layout is done. But I guess if Tudor wanted to be that specific, looking back to that true original in the past, this could be an option that we can expect. To the pros and cons of a Snowflake configuration in a Black Bay case. The positive, we could say, increases legibility, increases visual size, allocates a lot more space on the dial for the plots. These are all good things. It makes it a much more functional looking instrument and would serve its purpose a lot better as a dive watch. Another thing to note, that has been spoken about more than enough now, is that it is the icon. It's the one we truly identify to Tudor. The downside is that the Snowflake configuration with its jagged lines and edges doesn't work as well in a 50s inspired case. Remember, this watch doesn't have crown guards, and when you squint your eyes and you look at it, you can see it uses rounded forms everywhere else. The externals are all linked to a more organic nature. We look to the dial and we see that it is purely geometric. The advantage that the original Tudor Submariners had in this category was that their cases were sharp, they were angular. They had elements like crown guards, things that could complement the sharpness of the dial arrangement. That's a question that I pose to all of you in the subject. Does the Snowflake dial actually complement the form factor of the 50s inspired case? Another downside to this configuration from a manufacturing and cost standpoint is that they have to make these dials individually. It's a completely new format. And on top of that, will these be applied? Will they be painted on? Too many questions to ask. Regardless of what happens, it's not going to be a cheap exercise. So the more you look at it, the more you realize this might not be the best solution. And at this stage, coming up with these renders and ideas, I almost finished. I wrote it off thinking, well, either there's going to be a Snowflake or not. Let's hope for the best. But I neglected the 1980s. These models that came after the Snowflake are not anywhere near as popular. They aren't as picturesque. They aren't broadly spoken about. But what this arrangement does allow is follow the protocol that we've seen earlier. It looks at past inspirations. The arrangement is simple, it's easy to understand. It's an implementation of a new configuration that looks efficient. For this presentation, I've named it the MN80s with a dots and daggers dial. And all that changed was that the triangle at the top of the dial replaced the batons on the sides. Upon further inspection, I've noticed that this dial arrangement seems complementary next to the handset. The Snowflake hand with its sharp, jagged edges matches the quarter plots. And there does seem to be some harmony in this arrangement. Could we also say that this dial is reminiscent of 1950s aesthetics in one way or another, which does line up nicely with the rounded form factor of the case of the watch, since the rounded plots are also there to break up the dial and make it look softer. Seeing how the front and back of this watch could be presented, it looks very nice. As far as a cost-effective exercise goes, this is also one of the best. You're not having to retool anything. You're not having to change the dial very much. Just instead of using batons, you're using triangles, parts that they have excess of in their factory. This final result could also see the same treatment of patina on the dial, a faded bezel. Once again, it looks efficient. It does look like a dive watch from the 1950s, though still harkens back to 80s aesthetics. From a design point of view, the one thing I greatly admire about all of these Tudor-inspired dive watches of the various time periods is that they all fall into this geometric style. On the screen you should see a very simple arrangement of a diamond, circle and triangle, all of which have Bauhaus inspirations to the core. In the middle is the standard model that we are accustomed to seeing with 3 lines of text, and on either side are the alterations I've made. Let's be honest, these are safe predictions, but these are also rational, considering where the company is now, how they are experimenting with their flagship, and how so little effort is actually required to make an outstanding model in this area. Is it funny to say that of the 3, even though I love the Snowflake dial, I prefer the 80s aesthetic? I feel that it is a lot more complementary and balanced, and the Snowflake dial, as good as it is, might be too visually heavy, regardless of where this exercise goes. I'm still enthusiastic and excited to see what they do release. I have this firm belief that it is going to be a great launch. The end result will be a watch that not only collectors will love, it'll have a link to its lineage and its history, but will also start a new chapter on its own. We could say it's a watch that's going to be building off its own provenance, a set established blueprint that the brand can work off. And even if the result is lukewarm, and it's not a release that we wanted, and the end result is not as exciting as we thought it would be, it still is going to be something special. I just hope that Tudor has approached this exercise with the same amount of creative enthusiasm that a lot of us have, because this very well could be the most standout watch release from them this year. And now we have until September 1st to wait and see. A set established blueprint. A set established blueprint that the brand can work off.